Hello and welcome to the webinar Offshore Wind Amid COVID-19. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events, currently focusing on offshore and floating wind projects. This is one of several pieces of work we're doing on adapting to the current market disruption. There are over 800 of you signed up today, so thanks very much for the great response and thank you in advance to our panelists for their time. Just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar will last an hour and is being recorded, so we will send you the full audio recordings and slides within a week or so. You do have the facility to ask questions through the question box. Joining me today to address some of the key issues, Gunnar Herzig, who's the Managing Director at World Forum Offshore Wind, Jing Liu, who is the Sector Lead of Power and Utilities at SMBC, and Pieter Marinus, who's General Counsel and Investment Relations Director at Parkwind. If you do want to ask those questions, just a reminder again, go through the question box and we'll try to get through to them on the Q&A session. So without further ado, Gunnar, who will be the moderator of this session, do make an introduction.
Great, thank you very much, Luke. I hope you can all hear me well. Yeah, welcome also from my side. My name is Gunnar Herzig, Managing Director of the World Forum Offshore Wind, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating today's webinar on adapting and overcoming disruption offshore wind amid COVID-19. And as Luke already mentioned, we have two great panelists with us today, Pieter Marinus from Parkwind and Jing Liu from Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. And before jumping into the discussion, let me just give you a very quick overview of what we as the World Forum Offshore Wind do. So we are a non-profit organization founded in 2018, focusing specifically on offshore wind only. And we and our members represent the complete offshore wind value chain. And we have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore. And what do we do? So very straightforward, three things. We lobby for offshore wind on a global level. We inform about offshore wind via all channels that we have. And we connect the global offshore wind industry through our events and workshops. And then here you can see a quick overview of our members. So a great range and collection of international companies from all parts of the offshore wind value chain, including some of the international utilities such as JERA from Japan, Northern Power from Canada, RWE from Germany, but also other companies from manufacturing parts of the supply chain or service firms. So really, yeah, nice round picture of members, and also including some of the international organizations supporting offshore wind, such as the US Business Network for Offshore Wind, the Asia Wind Energy Association, the UK's EIC, or the German WAB organization. So that was it from my side as a quick overview. And now let's jump straight into the discussion. So yeah, we've already seen that as part of this crisis, we have seen a couple of major disruptions in the energy industry, such as the oil price crash or the reduction in electricity demand. But now let's talk specifically about what this means for the offshore wind industry. So my opening question to our panelists would be, yeah, what has been the impact of COVID-19 so far on the global offshore wind industry, maybe especially with regards to the different phases of projects, development, construction, and operation? And if maybe Pieter, if you would like to go first, and then Jing, happy to add any additional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Gunnar, also for the introduction, and also my part, hi to everyone that's listening in. To get straight to your question, I think the impact is quite significant. It was also immediate, I think, on almost all parts of our activities in development, in construction, and in operations, particularly for those that have not seen the press release, because we were basically finishing the works in our latest offshore wind farm, Northwester 2. Yes, it immediately had quite an impact that had to be managed. But I think from our point of view, safety was probably the most immediate concern. And at the same time, I think personally was quite impressed by the way both, let's say, our teams, but also the teams of the suppliers and all parties involved immediately responded and basically showed what could be done on the basis of an existing safety culture, which definitely helped to keep moving things forward.
Great, thanks. Jing, would you like to add anything from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think the impact we have seen may be different depending on the different stages of the project where they are. And for those projects at the development stage or still going through the bidding and auctions, we have seen a little bit more mixed picture here. Because, for example, some countries on authorities still carry on with the bidding despite the market turbulence and pandemic. For example, the HKN project in Netherlands, the bidding went ahead with the bidding being submitted on 30th April, with the result expected to be released in 13 weeks, according to the plan. But some other authorities have postponed the bidding and auction plan to give a bit more time to various potential bidders, giving the resourcing constraints and the logistics arrangement, as well as a procurement plan, etc. So I think on that front, a little bit of mixed picture there. And for those projects under construction, I think we may expect this this year the installation and the construction activities being slowing down due to the lockdown, and also depending on how long the national lockdown being happening in various different countries here. And for example, in the UK, for some big projects, I think during the lockdown, they still managed to carry on with some construction works, but some other projects have to stop temporarily. Although the construction work may have been resumed recently after the government started easing the restriction measures. But on the other side, if we look from the global perspective, given the different stages in different regions for the government to introducing the easing measures, we see, for example, the supply of components and the materials from China is ramping up after the interruption in February, and the continuous disruption in the other regions may slow down activity a little bit. And we also see, for example, some contractors and suppliers may have to issue the potential force majeure notice and for potential delay and disruption. And although this may not be materialized, but for the other projects in operation, I think a number of them, or quite a few of them, weather the pandemic reasonably very well, and by maintaining very high availabilities. But on the other side, I think these high availabilities are on the basis that the contractors and O&M contractors can maintain their workforce and also maintain their schedule. We have seen some report and news by suggesting some contractors literally have to pre-quarantine the workforce before boarding vessels, and in order to undertake the installation and the maintenance work. So this will add extra timeline and put on potential delay when it's coming to the maintenance requirements. So there might be potential risk on the availability. Although this is not materialized, and seems a number of projects, offshore wind projects, are weathering this crisis reasonably well at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. And I think you already touched on, on a very important point, Jing, the risks. So if we now look a bit into the future in terms of, where do you see the biggest risks for the global offshore wind industry over the next 1 or 2 years? Would you have any views on that? Maybe Peter, if you would like to go first again.
Yes, thank you, Gunnar. Well, I think there's a lot of risks you can see going forward. I think they all relate to one factor that is maybe even more present now than it was before, and that is the uncertainty around the different parts of project development and construction or operations. So I think where we see a risk is that, well, this uncertainty obviously translates into the financial markets and can really impact. At the same time, I would say the further project financing of projects, but it could also have an impact, and we start to see that, and hopefully government measures can help, but it can also impact credit quality of suppliers and other actors involved. So there's definitely a big concern around that, and then the stability of the supply chain is obviously important for projects that have worked out the planning on quite long term. But a planning that is also very sensitive to knock-on effects for unexpected events. In that, if a supplier falls away, it's not that easy to just replace it by someone else. I think the supply chain and the manufacturing slots for the past years are also quite demanded, so there is just not a lot of room to start moving around with the planning of your project. So that is definitely an important risk.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Jing, any risks from your perspective you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I think Peter has made a good summary. I think in addition to the supply chain risks, I would see some other challenges here. My personal view is that the first one would be in relation to the impact on those projects without subsidy support or without a supporting scheme from the government. And we have seen during the past several years in the West Europe, in the UK, the offshore wind sector has developed very fast. From several years ago, for example, in the UK, the offshore wind managed to get support for striking price of above £100 per megawatt hour on the CFD round 1. And then it's going down, it went down all the way to £39 per megawatt hour for the CFD round 3, literally last year, which was below the market reference price. And meanwhile, the investors and the financiers get more comfortable with the risk they are facing for offshore wind sector. That's why you also see the signs that some banks or financial institutions started taking some exposure on merchant risk for those unsubsidized projects here. But I think the COVID-19, the crisis, may put pressure on that front, given the fact that the economic uncertainty and the economic recovery uncertainty is there, and there might be more competition for the government supporting schemes there, and also because the wholesale power price going down, that puts more challenges for the projects with the merchant exposure. So as a result, this may impact the growth of the overall offshore wind sector, and giving the limited support scheme available there. And the other aspect is about this potential corporate PPA market, because without the government support schemes, one of the potential alternatives for the offshore wind sector or generators is to secure some long-term corporate PPA in order to raise financing. But given the current economic recovery uncertainties and market volatilities, we may see the industry and corporate clients become more cautious towards entering into long-term PPA, and they may want to be more focused on short-term to mid-term PPA in order to keep their corporate flexibility there. This is particularly true for those sectors in, for example, manufacturing and the industrial sectors, but some other sectors may weather better during this crisis, like data centers. They may still have strong demand for the PPA. But the other side is about the banks. Given the risk exposures, the banks may be more cautious towards the merchant deals, and they may need to do more due diligence. And also the overall power price downward adjustments for the wholesale price there. This may put pressure on what striking price you can achieve in these corporate PPAs. This may mean this corporate PPA may only work for those projects which are more efficient. I think the other risk I would see probably is that the potential government support here. And giving the failure of this, giving the reduction or fall of the wholesale power price, this may mean the increased spending requirement from government side. On one side, for the existing contracted revenue, that you may see that the market price, the gap between the market price and striking price becoming widening, and that means more budget fiscal allocation required. And on the other side is about what amount investment and required to be put into the renewable sector in order to meet the net zero target by the European Commission. And I think there are some reports suggesting that in order to meet the net zero by 2050 for EU, you literally have to have investment of around more than 150 billion euros per annum. But during the past decade, there was only around 60 billion per annum. So there was already significant funding gap. But given the current crisis and pandemic, the government focus, the short-term focus may be shifted to how to boost the economy and get economy recovery back to track, and also how to support the existing employment, and which may divert some budgets which could have been allocated to the renewable sector. But this result may be mixed, because some governments may take this as an opportunity to support more on renewable and offshore wind. Some may need to reduce the requirements for their green agenda for the time being in order to get economy back to track first.
Great, thank you very much for this very comprehensive answer, touching on different parts, even corporate PPAs and structures like that. And you already mentioned it to some extent. What are the banks going to do? So if we touch a bit more on the financing side of things, do you expect to see any changes in the behaviors of debt providers, but also equity providers, maybe institutional investors who provide equity to offshore wind projects? Maybe Jing, if you would like to go first, and then Peter, add any additional thoughts?
Sure. I think from the debt financiers' perspective, clearly there will be more scrutiny from the lenders, and given the risk and uncertainty of the economy recovery. And if we take example, for example, there was some analysis saying that the 10 largest European banks, if they want to put the same level as their counterparties in US, same level of provision for the potential bad debt, they may need to put aside more than $150 billion. So that's a significant provision required facing the potential uncertainties. That put pressure on the potential risk assets and what assets they can deploy. And given on these uncertainties and the market volatilities, we're already seeing that at the beginning of COVID-19, there was a spike of the funding cost for some financial institutions. Although this have settled down a little bit, but I think these volatilities of funding costs may pass on to the projects if some projects start raising funding now, given the uncertainties there. The other side is that the banks may be becoming more focused on their core markets and the key clients. And it's also reflected in the activities in the secondary market. We see some secondary market activities being reduced compared with what we saw previously. And this is primarily due to the banks now focusing on how they can manage their existing portfolios. And their credit team busy looking after the sectors experiencing challenges there. For example, like sectors in aviation, hospitalities, as well as potentially oil and gas sectors, given the fall of the oil price. So this may distract their effort and to look into potential new deals there. And the other side is that because with the slowdown of the secondary market, this will put on the impact on banks' appetite to underwrite and syndicate in the primary market, which will impact on the financing availability. Although I think in the midterm, long term, the bank is still quite keen and to support the green agenda. That's why we see renewable sector is one of the few sectors which still remain very active and still a lot of liquidity, still a lot of the interest in the market there. But there is such kind of short-term volatilities and various appetite changes there. And the other aspect is that banks will probably have to do more due diligence and documentations to ensure that the contractual protections to be in place properly, like the insurances and the caps on liabilities for contractors, to make sure that the project and the financiers are well protected. Just briefly touch on the equity financing side. I think my impression is that the market is still optimistic about the renewable and offshore wind, and the capital is still available, and the investors are still very keen to invest there. And both the listed and the unlisted fund are still deploying quite significant in renewables. Although some institutional investors who used to look more longer tenor investment may now shift to slightly shorter. But I think the investment in renewables, especially for those projects receiving the government supporting schemes, may be perceived as kind of safe haven for these institutional investors during such market uncertainties.
Great, thank you very much. And maybe, Peter, can I also give you an additional question, which we just received from Jan? So in addition to any financing implications, there was a question about whether the O&M assessment or the O&M risk assessment for offshore wind projects might change to any extent as part of this situation.
Thank you, Gunnar. I'll take that question first, and I think it's indeed something that very often is forgotten in the debates and during seminars about offshore wind. It's the O&M side, which is nevertheless very important, and I think it's a great question in the sense that of course these activities are impacted, and that today it is very hard to say what long-term impact of it will be. We see that, of course, we managed to carry out the most important maintenance activities. It comes with some additional challenges, but it's definitely not impossible. But also there you could start to see different setup necessary, less people on crew vessels, more expensive setup. To be able to continue to do that, maybe potentially some disruptions in the supply chain around spare parts or just people not being available or not being able to make it to the site when you really want them to be there. And I think all of that, if you combine that with the previous points on the auctions and the tariffs going down, I think OPEX is one of the aspects that have, I would say, almost been sacrificed to quite some extent for competitiveness, and these budgets are already very tight. So the question is how much room there is still to cover for what is now also an increased uncertainty in that area, and it's something to carefully watch out for, because of course all the investments are structured over very long term, and it's still our goal, and we're an equity investor in all of our projects as well, to ensure the lifetime of our projects and the productivity over that lifetime is being maintained. So it's also a particularly challenging domain at this point.
Great, thank you very much. And we just received another question from David about whether this might not be a good time to intensify the lobbying for offshore wind, so towards governments. So maybe if we, Jing, if you have any thoughts on whether it's likely that we will see some support from governments for the offshore wind industry specifically at this point in time. What would be your view on that?
Yeah, I think government support do take shapes there, and I think whether we lobby or not, government need to think about as overall picture how they can boost the economy, and clearly investment into renewable sector help them to achieve two objectives. On one side, the long-term objective to reduce achieve net zero is still there, so that's long-term objective if you can invest now. On the other side, you may want to take this as a chance to channel the more investment into renewable sector to help boost the economy and improve the recovery. Because we already see, for example, the government support may be demonstrated from both financial and potentially non-financial fronts. From non-financial perspective, for example, some government and authorities extended the auction bidding timelines, as mentioned earlier, to give the more time to potential bidders, given the restrictions, etc. And in terms of the project commissioning date, we know in order to meet the requirements for the commissioning window to benefit from supporting schemes, for example, like CFD, you have to make your project commissioning by a certain date. So some governments have already shown flexibility about the commissioning deadlines for this new project to come into stream to avoid the issue that the project may miss the commissioning window deadline. And this can be regarded as kind of the non-financial support from government for the sector. And from financial perspective, on one side, the sector, similar to the other sectors, will benefit. For example, in the UK, you get the employment protection scheme, which may be extended until the economy restarts. But on the other side, the government may review and rethink about their supply chain in order to balance their overall economy and minimize the potential disruptions, and to ensure that the local content requirements being balanced with the project economics as well as the supply chain security there. And I think the other positive signs we see is that, for example, in the UK, the Committee on Climate Change advised the government that these recovery measures the government need to take should be provided to support more low carbon infrastructure. And I think that's definitely very positive for the renewable and offshore wind there. And I think similarly, EU, I think although the policy now is mainly focused on how to tackle the COVID-19 crisis, but I think the European Commission has also very clearly stated that they will not cut back on the Green Deal work plan and timelines, and their leaders still committed to such kind of developments, and also want to do make it greener solutions as part of the overall EU economic recovery plan. So if the government are moving into this direction, I think that's even more positive for the renewable and for offshore wind, which may mean we may see more allocation and support, budget allocation and support from the public finance side. But on the other side, we also need to realize that for a number of governments, the first and utmost focus now is to get the economy back on track. So they may have to, for short term, to remove or reduce the requirements on the carbon dioxide emissions, or probably the green agenda may not be the immediate top priority, so they may need to allow the other sector to develop and the employment to be maintained for short term. But I think we would expect the government support there from both financial and non-financial perspective.
Great, thank you very much. Peter, any additional views on potential government support for the offshore wind industry from your side?
Well, I think you briefly touched upon it, but I think there's also an important aspect on the non-financial side, and not only looking to the future, but the governments, and I think in Belgium, the government did quite well making electricity and the renewable energy as part of that a critical sector. That allowed us to actually continue to construct our wind farm and carry out the most important maintenance operations. And I think if you look at that, that is not just, let's say, a top government decision. You need the cooperation of many other government entities, let's say, on the ground as well. And government should realize more and more, as renewable energy is a larger part of the energy mix, that is important to allow that to continue and to even facilitate that to the extent possible. And a good dialogue with governments on different levels is really important to establish that trust and to avoid that operations are interrupted when that's not really needed. All of that, of course, with the highest respect of safety standards and and the potential impact on society in mind. So I think, yes, from that point of view, it's also very important to establish a dialogue. I think our industry, particularly offshore wind, is also quite international, with people traveling back and forth, experts going all around. And that also there is probably quite some room for further integration of different rules or different policies, especially within Europe, I would say, to just make sure that there is a level playing field, and that for certain activities we don't hurt ourselves to opposing standards from one country to another.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. And maybe we can just slot in another question we received from Fernando on corporate PPAs. And Jing, you already mentioned it. It's not quite sure what the future is going to bring for corporate PPAs. In the past, I mean, we've seen some very interesting corporate PPAs in the offshore wind space with tech companies such as Google, or chemical companies like Covestro, or traditional companies like the German railway operator. Is that likely to continue in that positive trend, or do you see any likely slowdown due to the reduction in electricity demand, especially industrial electricity demand, if that is going to continue for longer? Maybe Jing, if you have any additional thoughts on corporate PPAs for offshore wind?
Sure. I think the potential results can be potentially mixed there, because if we look at the corporate PPA market there, and given the economic recovery uncertainties, so we may see some sectors like manufacturing and industrial sectors may slow down, which may put pressure on the corporate PPA demand from these sectors, which probably wouldn't be very good news for the development of the PPA market, given where they are and how they have been developing during the past couple of years. And when people get more comfortable in some countries now, for example in the UK, and to take more risks on the PPA counterparties there. But on the other side, it also depends on if there are other sectors can help cover certain cover these gaps there. And for example, the data centers and technology companies, they may see a boosted demand there. But the other signs that we do see the PPA appetite from some government or public authorities and councils who may want to enter into PPA as well, and also included like schools and universities, etc. So this may help create additional demand there. And the other side, that in the short term there might be impact, given the people's becoming more cautious towards looking into a long-term PPA market, which may which may slow down the how the project can raise financing, and by having impact on their debt sizing and the tenor. But on the other side, I think we see some government policies in Ireland or Italy who try to support the corporate PPA there. And we also see, for example, in Nordics, they tend to rely on corporate PPA anyway. So they may still be there and for certain regions, but some other economy may see some impact there. And I think the other side about the potential is the financing availabilities, because this also kind of the parameter which may impact on the PPA market. Because if your PPA, for example, your tenor is not long enough, then it may determine you may not be able to get the amount of financing you can achieve. So which will, on the other side, will impact our investment return on the front. I think the last thing is that this overall wholesale power price. As mentioned earlier, the trend of this lower price may continue. And if that's the case, that will put further pressure on what kind of striking price you can achieve in the corporate PPA. And then this may make some projects less economically viable under a lower striking price PPA, giving the overall wholesale price pressure there.
Great, thanks very much. And maybe Peter, can I throw in another question which we just received from Nick, which is related to corporate PPAs, but points to interesting another fact, and that is the fact that we've seen some companies not submit bids for the Dutch subsidy-free Hollandse Kust tender. Is that something that we might see more of in the future because companies might be a bit concerned, or is that maybe just very specific to this particular tender in the Netherlands? What would be your view on that?
Yes, it's a good question and a difficult one. Of course, we can't really take a view on the motivations of those particular companies that have announced that they wouldn't participate. But I think it's in a general way, it's not unexpected. I think it's merchant risk is still a difficult risk to deal with. Quite a few of those companies have already taken significant merchant risk in other auctions. So if you ask us, we're not surprised that all companies are more careful and will choose their battles. And that is, I think, in general, a bit of a risk for that type of auction system. That you don't know, there's so little certainty that you really cannot predict what the interest could be, and that it's probably also with the impact on electricity prices now something going forward that will even be harder to predict. So yes, but we're not surprised. Of course, we all still want to bring down costs of renewable energy and offshore wind. I think we're all committed to that. But I think there's a real debate to be had whether a CFD type of auction is not at least as good as those more zero-bid oriented auctions. So yes, it will be difficult and more risky to participate in those. So not everyone will do it all the time, I think.
Great, sounds good. And we just received another question, which I think nicely links to the topic of supply chain. So I think it's now interesting to see how do companies from the offshore wind supply chain handle the new challenges, especially things like travel restrictions, additional safety measures, social distancing, and then maybe specifically for you, Peter, people are asking, could you tell us a bit more how you dealt with some of those challenges during the construction of the Northwestern 2 project? How did suppliers handle those restrictions and challenges? That would be great if you could share your views on that.
Yes, thank you, Gunnar. I think yes, we kind of had to hit the ground running because we were in the field when the crisis really started to become clear to everyone, and our contractors and our project team really responded very well to that. I think everyone took it serious. We had to make a number of choices. I think we had vessels in the field, of course. Everyone knows about the 2-week sort of quarantine period. Now those vessels that were out there and which had no contaminations, of course they were kind of safe havens, and that's one of the concepts we worked around. I think unfortunately that meant that quite a few people also had to be flexible and probably broke records on staying offshore for much longer periods than they had originally intended to. But okay, I think there again, and in good cooperation and good spirit, those things were resolved. There were particular questions, especially when turbine termination and so on are going on how to avoid cross-contamination risks between those safe havens, which were particular challenges. So I think yes, the number of people involved in activities were reduced. The number of people on vessels, we tried to limit all of that to just reduce the risk to a minimum. And I think we, in the end, managed quite well. Our contractors, of course, they all have their own standards and all responded, and for everyone it was new, so there was no right or wrong approach, and it took sometimes some work to sort of make the approach fit. But again, I think if you're in that late stage of a project, everyone was very solution driven without compromising on safety, and that's what got us there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you very much. Jing, any additional thoughts from your side on the supply chain and how companies might handle the new challenges?
Yes, I think for the supply chain challenges there, I think in the offshore wind sector, the different components used in the sector may experience or may be impacted differently here. For example, I think probably blade, gearbox, and bearing may experience a bigger constraint on supply chain. And on the other side, I think they will put higher requirements about how the project will manage their stock levels there. And they may need to maintain that consistency for the stock levels, and also how the projects need to minimize the potential faults and errors, and also ensure the supply chain and is well stocked there. And we see some third-party suppliers may incur delays on restocking and delivery, while a limited few may only facilitate orders for emergencies, and due to the operational restrictions in place at their supply depots, storage facilities, and increased demand and limited availability of good haulers, and as well as limitation on manufacturers there. I think the other aspect is that how this local content requirements will help mitigate potential this supply chain interruption here. And because in the past, the trend for this higher local content requirements already there, and this trend will continue. Although in the past this may not be fully materialized, because you always need to balance how to ensure the project economics and the supply chain reliability. And but this pandemic may start shifting the balance between the two. And but the question still remains that how much appetite for the investor want to pay extra in order to secure it locally, and also whether the local manufacturers could compete with other potential competitors there.
Great, thank you very much, Jing. And maybe, yeah, Peter, we just received another interesting questions with regards to innovations. So yeah, David is asking the question, do we think that innovation, so using innovative components or O&M techniques or so, is that likely to be impacted by the new situation? Any views, yeah, on that with regards to innovations being used at the moment in offshore wind farms?
I would, well, if it's impacted, I would think it would be in a positive way. I think before there was, of course, a cost argument to try to do, especially in the maintenance, things remotely as much as possible. There was a safety argument as well of not bringing people out there if that was not really necessary. But I think with the COVID-19 crisis on top of that, there's probably even a bigger stimulus to make sure that with all the technology that currently exists, whether it's cable monitoring or drones or others, is to try and have less people in confined spaces and close to each other in the field as well. So I would expect that there can be a real drive in operations and maintenance, maybe also in installation, to try and do things differently. Of course, it's still new. There's a long way to go, but I would expect to see some positive evolutions there in the near future.
Great, that sounds quite encouraging. Excellent. Yes, so if we now move a bit into the structure of the offshore wind industry, especially with regards to the oil and gas companies, because we already mentioned it, we've seen some serious disruptions in the oil and gas industry, the oil price crash, but also some net zero emission targets that were set by oil majors such as BP, Shell, and Total. Yeah, what are your views? What do you think does that mean for the offshore wind industry in terms of maybe opportunities, but also threats? Or is it going to affect particular specific areas of the offshore wind industry, such as floating offshore wind? Any views with regards to how the oil and gas industry industry might affect the offshore wind industry going forward? Maybe Jing, if you would like to start with that.
Yes, I think we see recently that all the major European oil and gas companies, like what you mentioned, Total, BP, Shell, they all pledged to be committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And I think this may be expected to be achieved by reshaping their portfolio, by including more renewable assets, and also potentially lobbying for the policies, including carbon pricing, and also working with the countries and companies to help them hit net zero target as well. I think these announcements show all the oil companies investing in renewables, including offshore wind, as a bigger strategic priority for the next 3 decades. I think for oil industry, especially in European oil majors, they have been under pressure from investors to do more, and this trend will continue. I think the question is that if oil companies and players from on the gas side plan to invest more in renewables, I think overall it's still positive for development of the renewable sector and offshore wind, given the fact that they can potentially bring in more liquidity as well as a balance sheet and also the technical expertise. Mind you that within the offshore wind sector, we have borrowed a lot of technical expertise and experience from the offshore oil and gas sector there, like how this foundation being manufactured, the jacket foundation, and all these parts. So I think overall for the sector, I think it's a positive side, but on the other side, probably it's bringing more competition as well on that front for the existing players. And I think for this, giving the oil price movement here, I think from the potential negative side is that the oil price tend to be linked with the gas price, and for a number of countries, the gas price movement will have impact on their domestic power price. So with the pressure on the gas price, the power price downward trend may continue, and the issue that this may put more pressure on the merchant power project, given the wholesale price is lower, and which may make it difficult for investors to achieve more value there. But for those projects with the contracted revenues, they probably are better positioned there. But on the other side is that this oil price movement, this may accelerate the renewables in the midterm, given the fact that these major oil players may consider that oil demand may already peaked. Although for the oil industry, they still play a very important role in overall social economics, given the importance of petrochemicals, and so it's still far from the end saying that it's an end of the oil sector, because it's still very important given the petrochemical there, and oil has been the master of commodities. It's still there, but due to this drop in oil and gas price, this may make the wind solar projects and the renewable projects become more comparable from the investment return perspective. So even the oil price goes back up in the future, I think renewables may still present opportunities for these companies with strong balance sheets there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jing. Peter, anything to add on the role of oil and gas companies in the offshore wind industry?
Not that much. I think this was a trend that was of course ongoing. I think we saw them already quite determined to achieve something in our industry, and it is indeed they come with a lot of competences and experience in a related industry. The only comment I would make is, yes, let's see how that evolves, because of course they come into an industry at a time where well, there is a lot of uncertainty, and where the industry doesn't exist in such a long time, but I think experience is still very important, and you can make a lot of mistakes in these uncertain times. So yeah, I think let's wait and see how that evolves. It's not the easiest time to come into the offshore wind industry, I think, but that they are determined to do so, that is certain.
Yeah, sounds good. And maybe just a follow-up question for you, Peter, which we just received from Jan. Yeah, it's about contracting details. So, and specifically with regards to force majeure clauses in contracts for offshore wind. Is it likely that the COVID-19 situation is going to change any of those force majeure clauses to maybe exclude anything that has to do with the pandemic? Any views? I mean, it's quite a specific question. Any views on that, Peter?
Yes, I think we also, one of the first things we did, of course, is assess all those clauses in the different contracts to see what the impact could be. I think everyone also sort of contractors and others proactively informed the other parties that they were looking at it, and that this could be something they would have to invoke. I think after that first, I wouldn't call it moment of panic, but sort of that first round, things around that calmed down as it appeared that most activities, although with additional challenges, could continue. But yes, this is something, especially the pandemic is and I have a legal background as well, so it's part of those clauses, but it's quite likely that specifically for outbreaks like this, there will be more detailed language in the contracts. That is for sure. What that in practice really means, well, that remains to be seen.
Great, thank you very much, Peter. Jing, anything to add from your side on contractual strategies, how they might potentially change, or potential force majeure clauses that might be changed to any extent?
Yeah, I think one thing to be clear is that for both the investors, the project companies, as well as the financiers, there will be more scrutiny on these clauses going forward to ensure they are well protected, especially how they're going to trigger the force majeure. And the other side is that when you're looking at the project companies, on one side, they have to enter into this procurement contracts and O&M contracts, etc. But on the other side, they also enter into the financing contracts and financing agreements with the banks and the potential investors there as well, investment agreement as well. And now there will be more scrutiny to ensure that these contracts, especially for example, force majeure clause, etc., they need to talk to each other. So there should be kind of they need to be mirrored to ensure that the risk and being properly mitigated and addressed with the multiple contracts arrangement there.
Great, thank you very much. And we just received another question from Lauren with regards to workforce development. So do you think, maybe Peter, to you, yeah, it's likely that the workforce planning or the kinds of people employed in offshore wind farms is likely to change in any way due to the current situation? Or is that not something you are too concerned about?
Well, it will change. Whether we have to be concerned about that is probably a different question. But the planning will have to be more careful. You would have to, let's say, identify the groups, and probably we're not just going to continue to move around people without without really a concrete plan from one project or from one activity to another. So I think we are all looking into how we can have assigned certain groups to certain locations and avoid unnecessary cross-contamination risks while this virus is out there. And from there, probably new workforce planning practices may develop. We may even find some efficiencies there, which we never really cared to look at before. So yes, I think local presence, local O&M activities, and so on. There may be more demand for that, as it may not always be so easy to just bring in someone from further away.
Great, thank you very much. Jing, anything to add from your side on workforce planning, or how the workforce structure of offshore wind projects might be changed as a result of this situation?
Yeah, I think given the current situation, clearly this in order to meet this higher sanitary and health requirements, the various companies have to potentially rotate around the workforce. I have seen some recent reports saying that some O&M companies, so literally they need to allocate the workforce into different groups to ensure they can minimize the potential risks for individuals, to minimize the interaction there. But on the other side, I think the workforce deployment also evolved together with how this communication approach will evolve, and what kind of work can be done virtually. Because we already seen, for example, even like this webinar in the past, we tend to always go to the seminar and regional global conferences to meet 1,000 other attendees. But now we can easily achieve that via this virtual event organized by Reuters event team, which is much appreciated. So this new development of the technology and approach when people communicate, this may help reshape how the people communicate in the sector as well.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that fits perfectly as closing remarks, since this, I think, brings us to an end of this webinar, which I thought was extremely interesting. So thank you very much to our panelists, Peter Marinos and Jing Liu, for their very insightful comments, I think touching on a broad range of offshore wind aspects, from risks, financing aspects, supply chain implications, even very specific things like corporate PPAs and force majeure clauses. So if you want to know in detail again what people said, feel free to listen to the recording. And also thank you very much from my side for listening to this webinar. And I think with that, I'll hand it back to Luke. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gunnar, and of course, thanks a lot to our panelists. Excellent insight today, very useful, stimulating, and certainly food for thought. We do want to continue these important discussions, particularly with everything that's going on at the minute. So if you want to find out more and sign up to our other discussions, we have this all free for your use at the Offshore and Floating Wind Insight Hub. So do just jot that into Google so you can access all our content from there. And that includes this discussion, of course, which we will be putting on that platform within a week. And that wraps up nicely. Again, big thank you for you all for signing in and tuning in and asking your questions, and enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.